Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today for the IFA's weekly Global Café. I have the distinct privilege this morning of being your moderator and in being in conversation with Regius Professor Rose Anne Kenny. Professor Kenny is a medical gerontologist and professor of Physic and chair of medical gerontology at Trinity College, Dublin. She's the founding principal investigator of Ireland's largest population study of aging, TILDA, and the director of the Mercer Institutes for Successful Aging at St. James Hospital. She has received a number of international awards and has published widely, authoring over 600 publications, including her recently published #1 internationally best-selling book, Age Proof: The New Science of Living a Longer and Healthier Life, which was shortlisted for the Royal Society Science Book Prize in 2022. Today, we have an exciting opportunity to explore and get an inside look at some of the key topics presented through Age Proof, including how factors such as friendship, laughter, sleep, and stress can impact how we age, as well as debunk common misconceptions such as the role genetics play in the aging process. Professor Kenny, it is such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I want to kick off the discussion today by talking a little bit about your own journey, how the many hats you have worn have helped to shape and drive your work and perspectives. I think we often, in the introduction of your book, you talk a lot about being enchanted initially by the clinical side of aging, but we've seen that shift as kind of your work has progressed. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you started and how your journey has shaped and transformed how you see aging.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, and hello, everybody. Well, when I was a young doctor, I trained in London. I did my undergraduate training in Ireland in the University of Galway at the time, and then went to London for my training after I received my medical degree to the then Hammersmith Hospital, which is Imperial College London. And as part of the rotation, I was 6 months working with a geriatrician and with older patients. And of all of the rotations I did in training, which included cardiology, neurology, hematology, etc., endocrinology, I loved that 6-month period more than anything else. And it occurred to me, however, that there was very little active research in the area in trying to explain what was going on, what constituted the aging process, or even the diseases associated with aging. And there was very much a mindset at the time, a clinical mindset, that it's age, we can't do much about it. So even the professor I was working with was the first to actually do research and write a textbook on normal biochemistry of aging. Up until then, populations over the age of 65, 70 hadn't actually had normative data derived from blood draws. So that's how crude the field was at the time. So I became very interested in it. And having done my training, I started to do cardiology and did a lot of research in cardiology. Most of what I was doing was research in cardiology and aging, particularly different cardiac pacemakers for different sort of syndromes associated with growing older and a defective conduction system in the heart. And then I took that with me into my geriatric training, and that's my main clinical research interest. And I'm in one of those clinics now, looking at cardiovascular causes of falls and blackouts in aging.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Kenny. Lots of content to get through today, but I kind of wanted to start a bit at some of the basics. I'd love to hear from you a little bit about how we age, why we age, and the importance of using a life course approach when we understand aging, or when we attempt to understand aging.
Well, I think we can start from the premise that there's a big difference between our chronological age, that's the number of candles on our birthday cakes, and biological aging, which is truly the process at a cellular level that's evolving. One thing, we all age, everybody ages, but we do age at different rates, which is why it's important to understand more about how we actually measure true biological aging. And that's very much where my research is centered at the moment. And the point of that is, if you can get subtle measures of biological aging, then you can identify early on when the process is starting, when the accelerated pace of that process occurs, And hopefully, by understanding more about the process, we can use interventions, different treatments targeted at slowing down the process, because really all that process is an accumulation of cellular factors, biological factors, which eventually accumulate to such a level that they go above a threshold and become diseases or disorders. And of course, the big diseases and disorders I'm talking about are arthritis, heart disease, stroke, thyroid disease, problems with the musculoskeletal system, and dementia. So understanding the processes which occur early on before those diseases present should help us to identify at an early stage modifiable risk factors for those diseases. We spend anything between 20 to 30% of our lives with a disability, one of those diseases or disorders. And if we could possibly compress that period of time, the vast majority of which is at the end of our lives, compress that period during which we're experiencing diseases or disorders, that would be a huge step forward.
Absolutely, Dr. Kenny. And you kind of touched on a piece of a misconception here, which is kind of the inevitability of the aging process. And this balance between genetics and kind of modifiable factors. I wonder whether you could touch on this kind of genetic component that often gets fixated on, and then the role also of epigenetics, which you touch on quite extensively in your book. So
epigenetics is a way of actually measuring the biology of aging. It's a clock. There are lots of them. I mean, when we started this research about 12 years ago, 15 years ago, into different epigenetic measures, and it was headed by American researchers, particularly Steve Horvath and Morgan Levine, and also Hannon in mainland Europe. Since that time, we have about 20 different clocks now. So it's a very fast accelerating area. It still isn't accurate enough. What we do is we've got 20,000 roughly genes, fixed genes, between 20 and 30,000. They're fixed. They're our genetics. We can do nothing about that. But on those genes, there are we call them CPG sites. And they're kind of active sites which give information to other components of the cell to produce proteins. And the proteins produce energy. And that's where we get our energy. That's where every single cell in the body gets energy. So the more active and fluid and flexible and dynamic those sites are, the better it is, the more they're able to function. By what we use in the clocks is we literally count the activity of those sites, those CPG sites, those epigenetic sites. And from those counts, we derive an epigenetic clock. And there are lots of different clocks depending on the number of sites that are used in the equation. Sometimes, 1,000 different sites are used in the equation, and we have many, many thousands of these sites. However, the clocks are becoming more and more refined now, so that we are now developing, I've just come off a meeting about our own work on a frailty clock, which can actually predict subsequent frailty and early manifestations at a cellular level of the likelihood of developing frailty 10 years hence. There are musculoskeletal clocks, there are cardiac clocks, etc. So rather than an overall biological aging clock, now we're getting involved in organ and system clocks, because not every single organ ages at the same rate. Otherwise, when we get arthritis, we'd also get dementia, we'd also get a heart attack, we'd also get a stroke, the end outcomes. So that's where the area of biological clocks is at the moment. But I have to say that the clocks are not accurate enough yet for anybody on this call to send a blood sample and be told accurately what your biological age is. I know that there is a lot of private enterprise interest in this area, and there are private organizations providing that service, but for those of us in the science community, it is not as yet accurate enough.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kenny. So I guess the million-dollar question for you then is, how do we get our clocks moving faster? If the clock's moving faster is a good thing, then what can we be doing to get our clocks?
We want the sites to be more dynamic, but the clocks to move more slowly.
Clocks move more slowly, more dynamic.
Yeah, so we want to slow down. We want to slow down the pace of aging. Well, okay, so there are, when I said that we've got fixed genes and we could do nothing about that, that is the case in humans. However, we can actually modify the activity of those sites, those biological sites. And the way we do that predominantly at the moment is through environmental factors. We know this from identical twin studies. So if you take identical twins, not at birth necessarily, but say when they're 70, they've had very often, usually, a very different life course experience. And that experience of life shapes differently their aging process and the pace of aging. So their genes are fixed. So it's a fantastic experimental model. Genes fixed, no variation there. Therefore, what are the independent influences of environmental factors that occur during the life course? What do I mean by environmental factors? Things like stress, very important, psychological stress, physical stress. How have they impacted? Things like socioeconomic status, which obviously overlaps with stress. And we know, for example, again in our study, that those in the highest groups of social class, if you like, that they experience significantly less diseases with aging at a given age than those of the lower socioeconomic strata. The difference at each extreme is 11% versus 43%. That's how big, that's the magnitude of the difference. And that's in the Irish study. So socioeconomic position hugely impacts on the speed of aging. The other thing, of course, is diet. And you know, everybody says, oh, we know about diet, but diet is actually really, really important. And I come back to what I was saying earlier on about the energy production in cells. That's all we're about. We're about producing energy in a cell to keep us alive and to keep in the, depending on which cell, that organ alive and vibrant, and getting rid of the toxic byproducts from that energy production. All energy, oil, etc., oil refineries, when energy is produced, there's a byproduct, which is usually toxic, that needs to be gotten rid of. Our cells are exactly the same. And very often, some of the hallmarks of aging in a cell are actually evidence of inability or slowing of the process of getting rid of that toxicity. So diet is huge, because what that is in the context of energy production in the cell, we get the energy from our diet. That's the source of energy, which is why it's so important. And the getting rid of the byproducts of the use of the good bits of the diet in the cell is also one of the things we know that slows down with faster biological aging, pace of aging. So diet does matter. Of course, exercise matters. And one of the big things with respect to exercise as we get older is loss of muscle mass. We lose about 1 to 2% of muscle mass every year after the age of 40 on average. So muscles strengthening exercises, i.e. resistance exercise programs, as well as aerobic programs are very important. And then there's what was used to be considered as soft science, but is now actually incredibly exciting science, is the value of social networks, social engagement, community, friendship, quality of relationships. All of those things actually influence our biology, because we have evolved to need other people within a tribe. You know, everybody has their function in a tribe, but it's really important that the tribe engages. So social network, social engagement, quality of your relationships make a big difference to our biology. We've evolved for that. In fact, good social engagement, good social network, friendships, in other words, are as an important risk factor for heart disease and death from heart disease as smoking, to give you an example. So that's how powerful friendship is. And in that context, then, how important laughter is. Laughter is a medicine. We've said that for many, many years, and laughter is a potent medicine. So they're the kind of modifiable factors. That's what I mean by environmental factors. All of those extraneous influences that we experience during the life course, which, if they're negative, accumulate to accelerate the aging process.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kenny. I want to touch on this aspect of stress and community, but really hone in. As you may know, the WHO recently announced a new global commission on social connection. The aim of the commission is really to spotlight the public health problem of social isolation and better understand how we can kind of solve it. When we think about social isolation, I think we often think about the mental health implications, but there's a huge physical side as well. You've touched on this, but I'm wondering whether you can kind of elaborate on some of what causes that and what is that underlying connection there? Okay,
absolutely. So probably the core pathway that we are more and more now believing is critical to the process of aging is a thing called inflammaging. So when inflammation is necessary, inflammation is something that we've evolved to need to fight a insult to the body, like a bacteria, a virus, or a fungus, which the body perceives as being foreign and bad. We develop an inflammatory response to get rid of that toxic hit, that noxious hit. And then our inflammatory systems, which are circulating antibodies, T cells, B cells, etc., right back to a resting level. And that's a good response. That's a normal response. That's why we developed inflammation. The other things I was talking about, stress, lower socioeconomic position, poor diet, poor exercise, etc., they also can trigger inflammation. And that's what we don't want, because that sort of chronic rumbling away in the background inflammation is actually alien to our cells and accelerates biological aging. Our cells don't like that sort of chronic inflammation. So that just explains the background to these environmental factors. I saw somebody kind of wrote a question in the chat box very closely aligned to that. Now, let me talk then more closely about social isolation and loneliness in the context of inflammation. We know well that social isolation and loneliness can trigger this chronic inflammation. And it can happen quite quickly. For example, if a rhesus monkey which is a gregarious animal, is isolated even for 48 hours, and samples are taken from the lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes are engines for inflammation. They give us all of the information about how active or inactive our inflammatory systems are. Those monkeys within 48 hours of social isolation have upregulated the pro-inflammatory genes. In other words, it started a very active inflammatory process. So even in humans, we know from our own longitudinal data set that in people who have experienced painful loneliness or uncomfortable social isolation that they're emotionally uncomfortable with, their inflammatory markers, just from taking blood samples, are higher than people who actually do not self-report loneliness or social isolation, which is uncomfortable. So we do know that loneliness and poor social engagement actually act through these inflammatory pathways and therefore accelerate biological aging. And in fact, even with respect to dementia, it's been well shown and validated that social isolation and loneliness, which is the emotional part of social isolation, actually are significant risk factors for dementia, as well as for things like cancer and cardiovascular disease, again through inflammatory pathways. I would love to see a world where loneliness, we were trying to target net zero loneliness. It's something we should really be giving serious thought to at a societal level. It isn't a costly drug, therefore it doesn't have big pharmaceutical underlying support. But loneliness is perversive and very toxic to us as humans. We're gregarious, we're like the monkey, we need people. Now, of course, the very people you're trying to assist with respect to that are the ones who find it hardest to reach out, because by definition, that's why they're lonely. And I have no magic solution for this. I just think that we really need to be exercising ourselves much more with respect to this big issue in a meaningful way. It's getting worse. It's now, you know, I mean, some authors have suggested it's a pandemic or epidemic levels, but it's very, very pervasive.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kenny, and hopefully we can throw our weight behind some of the WHO Commission, because I think there's lots of good work to do there. I want to turn to a few questions in the chat now, Dr. Kenny, and we have one from Shmuel, who attends our global cafes every week and always has interesting questions. A bit of a departure so far, but I'd love to hear from you, or Shmuel would love to hear from you a little about the future of aging. So where is the kind of the research and the science taking us in the future, and how will that impact kind of how we provide care and the accessibility of that care, particularly for low and middle income regions?
Okay, so there's a load of questions there.
It's a loaded question.
Okay, so I mean, I'll start with the lower income, and then I'll talk about where the aging research is going. First of all, with respect to lower and middle income regions, very many of these regions are actually experiencing aging I'm talking now about at a country level, much faster than, say, Western civilizations. You know, the French had something like 150 years to get used to a doubling of the proportion of their population over the age of from 7 to 14% over the age of 65, whereas other major economies now, the African continent, India, China, their numbers who are aging are doing so at a much faster level, at a population level. I'm not talking about the aging process biologically, I'm talking about numbers proportionately, demographically. And the issue there is that not infrequently, there just aren't the social and health infrastructures that we've evolved comfortably with, because it's been a slower process to actually intervene appropriately for older citizens. So there are major issues there, and clearly the WHO is very engaged with evolving systems that will assist globally. But so it's a big global issue. Coupled with the demographic aging changes, of course, there are significant drops in fertility worldwide, and that's altering the ratio of workforce to retirees, etc., which may also have issues. Where is the aging research going at the moment? I think there's probably there's so many different ways it's going in so many different directions. But if we just take two of the most dominant ones, one is what I said earlier on, and this is what most researchers in the field that we would work with their aspirations are, and that's to condense the period of time we spend at the end of our lives with multimorbidities or disability or loss of independence. Okay, so that we ensure not longer lifespan, but healthier, longer lifespan. That's the objective. However, there is a lot of resource being put into the potential for halting the aging process or reversing the aging process almost ad infinitum. And billions are being poured actually into research in this area. And there are some scientists who believe we can halt aging, or some actually refer to, and I don't agree with this, cure aging, because it makes it sound like aging is a disease of itself. For many reasons, I disagree with that strongly. But I mean, you know, there's a much bigger question around that. If we do that, I mean, how are we already we're struggling with population demographics? You know, how would that look? So there are huge ethical issues in the context of that aspiration, even. But I think it's noble to try to reduce the period of time that anyone experiences disability to enhance independent living and quality of life.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kenny. I have so many of my own questions, but I'm going to go to Eileen, who has a great question for you. Eileen, would you like to turn your mic on and ask your question?
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. Professor Rose Anne Kenny, I've listened to you lots of times and I've met you at venues, and as usual, it's fantastic clarity, and I really love listening to you. I just have one particular targeted question on the biomarkers for aging and research. In particular, you're the first person I've heard who has put thyroid in with a list of what's known as arthritis and cardiac and other illnesses. But the general range norms for biomarkers tends to be for the average population. There's an intervention, I gather, is on research on medication that's 40 years old. Are you aware of any research into the biomarkers for older age in relation specifically to thyroid, and in particular in relation to older women, older adults and women in particular? Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely question. There are some groups actually looking at this. There isn't anything definitive as yet. We have very clear thresholds for hypo, underactive, hyper, overactive thyroid at the moment in a clinical setting. However, it's quite likely that those thresholds are not actually appropriate for understanding the influence of the thyroid at a cellular level. And just for those online who mightn't be that familiar with its activities, an underactive thyroid basically slows down all of the cellular processes. An overactive thyroid accelerates processes. And the way that they present clinically, an underactive thyroid is fatigue, slow movement, swelling, feeling the cold, constipation. Overactive thyroid presents with anxiety, agitation, tremor, fast heart rate, irregular fast heart rate, sweating, etc. So they're the clinical signs. Now, however, the thyroid is integral in many, many cellular processes, and it's a biologically plausible hypothesis that more subtle changes in thyroid function may influence the aging process. A number of longitudinal studies are exploring this at the moment. We don't as yet have definitive correlations between subtle thyroid change and true biological aging pace. The thymus gland, which is another gland involved in, which is a gland involved mostly in inflammatory processes and active up until, early 20s, mid 20s, and then involutes, it stops activity, actually probably does play a very key role in the aging process. And there's a lot of interesting work showing in animals that by using different interventions to extend thymus activity or enhance thymus activity, you actually impact on epigenetic aging. So I'd say I would watch the thymus space rather than the thyroid space.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kenny. A great question here from Cynthia around kind of some of the intersections with ageism and sexism. Cynthia, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for being with us this morning, Professor. I really am always fascinated about the intersection with ageism and sexism across the life course and how it differentially affects our aging processes. But I wondered also if how you address ageism and sexism in your own work and training.
Thank you. Well, training is different to work. First of all, I'll take the work. Actually, from the very get-go in the Tilda study, we introduced questions, validated tools on aging perceptions, which capture your experience of extraneous aging attitudes and the impact that they have on your own internalization of attitude and how you perceive yourself, therefore, to be aging. It's absolutely fascinating work. And I know you've had some other discussions around this previously, but just to summarize how you perceive yourself aging, from our research, independent of all other factors that influence the aging process, affects your physical and cognitive aging pace. So if we measure walking speed, for example, which is a very sensitive measure of how one is aging biologically, if you perceive yourself to be younger than your chronological years at the beginning, at the first wave of our study, 12 years after that, you walk more quickly and you're less likely to have frailty markers than others who perceive themselves to be their chronological age. Now, of course, you might say, yeah, but that's because an individual might perceive themselves to be their chronological age because they have other illnesses going on, which, you know, pull them down and make them feel more negative about themselves. But we're able to actually adjust for all of that in the statistical analysis. So insofar as you can do that, it would appear that aging perceptions are independent predictors of the aging process. So you are as young as you feel. Okay, so if we take that as and it's not just our group that have shown that, there's some lovely Levi's group, etc., have done most of the pioneering work in this area. If we accept that, then the influence of societal ageism is very difficult in that context. What I mean is, if you're constantly being bombarded by negative messages, subliminally, it's very hard for you to be positive about the aging process and have positive perceptions of your aging process if there's a constant negativity. And I think it's getting better. Media, particularly, I'm focusing on now. Okay, I think it's getting better. But however, you know, COVID really threw back the curtains on this, and a number of a number of countries, cultures were exposed in the context of ageist attitudes during COVID. So I think it's a very thin veneer of, you know, that once it's exposed, there are still a number of ageist attitudes. Clinically, well, unfortunately, again, during COVID, it was exposed clinically. Certainly on these islands, in Ireland and in the United Kingdom, the Association of Anesthesia recommended that we use a certain frailty scale to determine whether someone was appropriate for admission to the intensive care unit. But actually 50%, half of the weighting of the scale was age. And if you were 70, it was almost impossible to score well on the scale. So even clinically, and we experienced it ourselves. I had arguments during COVID with colleagues who wanted, we have a beautiful new unit here, Mercer's Institute for Successful Aging. I'm in the acute hospital at the moment. It's in the heart of the acute hospital. We have 120 beds and they're nearly all single rooms. Now, some of you from the States, etc., might say, but you always have a single room in a hospital, but we don't. We have wards with people in, generally speaking, unfortunately. That's the old-fashioned model that here and in the UK is prevalent. In our institute, however, because it's new build, and thank you to Chuck Feeney, the Atlantic philanthropist who supported us on that, we have nearly all single rooms. During COVID, despite the fact we had older, sick patients in those rooms, but very, very few got COVID because of the structure. during COVID, my colleagues argued that we should move all of those older patients into a general ward and put COVID patients into the rooms. So move them all into a general ward where they would definitely have got COVID. So even I've experienced that even myself amongst clinical colleagues. Needless to say, it did not happen, but you know, that was the attitude at the time.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kenny. Very interesting. I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea of friendship and laughter. I want to get at kind of what you mean by friendship and laughter. I'm assuming, I think we all can happily have the experience that we have, you know, 250 friends on Facebook or something. I don't think that's the friendship you're talking about. So I'd love to hear a bit about what makes kind of friendship or the quality of friendship important for kind of successful aging. What does that look like?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think when you look at quality, you're looking at closeness, you're looking at the ability to share problems with people, you're looking at the ability to have a good laugh with someone. They're some of the different components of a quality of a relationship, quality of a friendship. I think intuitively we understand it, you know, if we have a good quality relationship or engagement with someone. It isn't about number, it's about quality. And it is a truism that a problem shared is a problem halved. There's been a lot of research actually showing that. So that's what's meant. It isn't actually the current model of, you know, 1,000 or 1,000 friends on Facebook or whatever. Yeah. That is not what we're talking about, because that's not necessarily at all sharing problems. It's quite the reverse, actually. Very often can set standards that individuals find difficult to adhere to, and expectations are false. That's not problem sharing. So it's the quality of your relationship. Laughter is interesting. We've evolved, laughter is actually a form of bonding. It's like a bonding communication. And the simplest way to understand that is to reflect on the types of laughter. The sort of laughter, you know, the belly laugh you will have with a friend over something really funny that you both share the same sense of humor and you understand, is very different to the modest, polite laugh in response to a very bad joke that your boss has just told. So they're different, but you can actually see the strength of bonding and communication in those two examples. Laughter actually reduces inflammatory responses, and there have been experiments to show this. And even anticipating laughter reduces stress hormones and stress signals through the autonomic nervous system by up to 70%. And laughter therapies have been introduced to reduce length of stay post-surgery, for example, or to one laughter therapy experiment actually reduced the recurrence of heart attack by 41% in a group of patients who had had a heart attack. So laughter has been used therapeutically. I used to joke that, however, if I had had surgery and a clown came into my room to make me laugh, I would definitely discharge myself. So I don't know if I can actually assume that all of the shorter length of stay was necessarily directly associated with laughter itself. But there's very good science to show how important a good laugh is.
That's great. Thanks so much, Dr. Kenny. Kind of dovetailing off of that a bit, how do we then, in an increasingly digital world, and we talk about digital inclusion a lot, how do we ensure that the, you know, our desire to kind of facilitate or foster that connection isn't lost in that digital space? Is there best practices for how we can be ensuring that is a real tangible connection versus what so often is in digital, which is, you know, either the Facebook or the Instagram or kind of the lurking that happens? How can we kind of have meaningful engagement?
We should be using technologies to enhance social engagement. It can never replace, in my opinion, the face-to-face interaction with another human. That's because it's taken so long for us to evolve, to register signals and to be in tune with another when face to face. Whereas, you know yourself, even now, you know, Zoom doesn't give you at all that same engagement, nor do any other platforms. But they can, of course, enhance. I mean, this is probably, I hope it's slightly an enhancing experience for people engaging on Zoom. However, I would caution that some older persons that we have studied find themselves marginalized and excluded by technology because A, it's moving so quickly. B, most access to travel or banks, etc., is now via technology. And if you're not comfortable with technology, there are rarely options to actually engage with someone in the service providers at a face-to-face level. And so therefore, I think that technology is a double-edged sword. I think we should treat it respectfully. It can very much enhance relationships, but there is another aspect of it that we really need to address in the marketplace.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kenny. Got a great question here from Ken around kind of the housing aspect of this equation. Ken, would you like to come forward and ask your question? Ken, are you with us?
Is that the we in Canada push the housing first model?
Yes, yes, it is. Do you want
to housing or building co-housing? Okay, Ken, are you there?
Yes, I am. Slow to get my coordination in. Yeah, you know what, I addressed it from the housing first model, and then we've morphed our model to be more addressing co-housing, because I totally wholeheartedly agree, and I've seen it in so many situations in our research here, that loneliness, lack of proper health, lack of walking can be addressed with housing first if you build the right model. If you just build in our video, you'll see from pinecresthousing.org that if you build an apartment building, people will be lonely. If you build co-housing, people will live in community and support and encourage and life-giving environment, as far as I'm concerned. And so that I said, yeah, I don't want to build a nursing home and I don't want to build an apartment building. So I have a volunteer team that has purchased a school and we're building co-housing, and I think it'll be a model that'll be replicable across Canada.
Yeah, that's great. It's great. There's been some co-housing models as well in the UK and even in London, and for all age groups, actually, intergenerational, which is also very healthy. And I mean, I'm completely supportive of co-housing. I mean, people need choice. There's some people who would hate it, but you know, it's great to have a choice if you wouldn't. That's the first thing. Of course, it makes a difference to loneliness, and let's not assume loneliness is the prerogative of older persons. It is not, and particularly since COVID, there's a huge problem with mental health issues and loneliness in younger persons. And I
think that's definitely our concern, that we don't just build for seniors, but I think that's the group that needs to be addressed first. COVID certainly pointed that out, and the death rate of seniors, and when one spouse dies, the other spouse dies within a year in most situations, and you put them in a nursing home, you've got a life expectancy of 6 months, I think it is, or a year. So we don't want to go that route, and we look at our facility because there's 20 acres and others all schools have large playgrounds, so build additional demographic group housing within those same models.
Yes, no, I agree.
Thank you for your speech.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I see there's another question here on technology and the value of technology and engaging particularly with fitness and other activities. And of course, I agree with that. However, I would also caution that a number of people during COVID became accustomed to doing classes online rather than within a group in a geographical setting with other people. And I actually think you're missing out on something on the bigger picture. by doing that. And I would recommend, if possible, that people re-engage with face-to-face classes of yoga or Pilates or whatever your flavor is, because you get so much more from the social engagement in addition to the exercise, and they enhance each other.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kenny. I have kind of a comment here from Mawalu, which is around the role of vaccination in this picture of healthy aging. Mawalu, would you like to kind of speak to some of your comments? A moment for mics to enable. It's early for some of us. All right, well, perhaps I can ask a bit of a question around that, Dr. Kenny. One is has your research looked into kind of the impact of vaccination on the healthy aging process? And I guess how has the factor of something like an immunosenescence, how much of that is modifiable when you talk about kind of the environmental factors that you're able to kind of reduce or slow that aging process?
There's been some, just with respect to vaccination, apart from infections, there's been some really interesting recent research from groups actually in Dublin and in the UK, showing that in repeated influenza, that people who had repeated influenza vaccinations were less likely to develop dementia. So that's not something we commonly think of with respect to influenza vaccination. That's the first thing. Immunosenescence is interesting. Immunosenescence is a term, just for everybody, whereby we use certain cells, circulating cells, and changes in those cells as hallmarks of aging. The interesting thing about senescence is actually there are treatments now being explored called senolytics, which influence those circulating senescent cells. But many of the senolytics are being explored in diseases out with aging, although also in aging, such as cancer. Lots of cancer treatments are actually senolytic treatments, which is interesting in terms of their process. For example, some other autoimmune disorders, again, more common with aging, but nonetheless, autoimmune disorders that can occur at any age. Or we're also exploring, we being the bigger community, senolytics in that context, etc. So immunosenescence, which is aging of the immune system, but marked by senescent cells. There's a lot of research in that area in the context of senolytics. And again, it all feeds back into inflammation, because inflammation is driven, obviously, through the immune system.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kenny. You touched on diet recently, and there's a great question here about how the future of aging plays into or alongside this kind of rapid advancement in our food industry as well. Musinga, would you like to come forward and ask your question? Wait a minute. I'll pose the question myself. Does the future of aging take into consideration the fast-growing food industry, which is a risk factor for cardiometabolic disease, which is in the future of aging enhance more disabilities in older adults? So this idea of kind of the huge trajectory that the food industry has been on, the impact there.
And actually, you know, we've recently seen in the USA and in the UK particularly, an attenuation of this linear association between time passed and the increasing lifespan. What do I mean by that? We're aging at the moment by 2.2 years per decade, every 10 years. So somebody born, that equates to 3 months per year. So a baby girl born last year in Ireland, her sister born this year will likely live 3 months longer than her. I mean, that's what that translates into. However, we're now seeing, and it was a direct linear association in the last 200 years, with an increase in time between 1800 and 1850, 1850 and 1900, etc. Lifespan directly increased linearly during those different 5 years, say, or 50-year trajectories. However, that is attenuating, and most of the research now would attribute that attenuation, in other words, a flattening of that linear relationship, a slowing down in extended life expectancy and lifespan, to poverty and a bigger poverty gap and lower socioeconomic position, and possibly the excessive use of ultra-processed foods. And this comes back to the food question that your listener raised. And this is a shocking statistic. Again, I'm referring to the UK because that's most of my knowledge base is related to that, and Ireland. In the United Kingdom at the moment, 57% of food intake by people over the age of 50 is processed or ultra-processed. 91% of food intake by children is processed or ultra-processed. So now we're saying, wow, if that's the case, and we know that ultra-processed food is bad for a number of the cellular processes we've just discussed, it changes your microbiome. Your microbiome may be integral to this whole aging process, not definitely shown as yet. But it's certainly ultra-processed food leads to much more cardiometabolic disease and obesity, particularly. Like, is that going to really significantly impact on the projections for extended aging and lifespan going forward? Probably yes. I mean, almost definitely yes. And it's a challenging issue. Processed foods and ultra-processed foods.
Dr. Kenny, I think that the term ultra-processed foods has become increasingly popular, but can you explain a little bit about what you mean when you say ultra-processed foods? What should we be looking for?
Yeah, sure. Anything in a packaging. Look, it's easier to think of what's the flip. That's fresh. Fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, fresh fish, fresh meat. They're not ultra-processed. But anything in a package, and what happens is the constituents are taken, they're mushed up, flavorings are added and colorings are added, and they are reconstituted to look like a burger or to look like, obviously, chocolate bars or ultra processed or etc. So it's not pure foods. The actual chemical structure of the foods has been changed, and then obviously components added. The way to think about ultra processed is it's something you don't find. This is ultra processed now. They're food constituents that you don't find normally in your kitchen. I'm kind of going to have to go soon now because I'm actually in a clinic here. I've got a queue of young doctors waiting to talk about patients to me. Do you want to just maybe do one or two more questions, Anna?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do one or two more questions and then we'll let you go. Why don't I just give you a moment, Dr. Kenny, and we'll come back to you for some kind of key takeaways. But for right now, I'll have Ashley pull up our speaker for next week.
Okay.
So next week, we have the pleasure of having Mr. Charles Waldegrave, who will be coming to speak about housing and living standard impacts on older adult experiences. So make sure you tune in next week. We'd love to have you join us and looking forward to another fantastic and dynamic discussion. So Dr. Kenny, as we approach the hour, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure. And really, I'd love to hear just if you could tell us 3 things that you want us to take away from today's discussion, the 3 most important things that we can be putting into action to make sure we all age healthfully.
My one bottom line would be the earlier the better that you intervene with the different lifestyle behavioral factors we discussed, but it's never too late. And there's a lot of evidence behind that. So don't be disheartened by that. It's never too late. Work on your attitude and having a positive attitude towards the aging process, and engage with peers in order to ensure that you're getting bolster and support for that positive attitude, because it's hard to do it just on your own. And if possible, work on quality friendships. And after today's podcast, maybe reach out to someone. You won't be rejected. Nearly everybody is also in the same boat, and if you will gain and they will gain from your reaching out.
Perfect. Well, first and foremost, Dr. Kenny, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you, as always, to the Global Café audience. You've been terrific, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you all.